Good evening, this is the Oscar Expert here with Brother Bro, and it's time to review All Quiet on the Western Front. This is an adaptation of the classic World War I novel that was turned into a Best Picture winning film
for 1931, one of the first Oscars ever. I feel like the main purpose of this film was to immerse us in this war and make it feel real and alive again. And this is a really powerful example of visceral filmmaking that puts you right in the mud with these soldiers and their, little like blue-eyed baby faces as they witness the horrors and bloodshed surrounding them.
It just wants to quickly wipe away that innocence that these soldiers have going into the war, like, we're participating in the war, yahoo, and then they get there and it's like, oh shit, this is hell. We're literally in hell now and we can't escape.
And to put you in the trenches, as an audience member, take you on this experience. More films can tend to make action look exciting, and this film is enthralling in a sense. It is very spectacular, but it doesn't make it fun. So it's like doing both things at once. This kind of delivers in a sense on, action and adventure in a weird way, in kind of a fucked up way. But at the same time, it looks so unfun and miserable that it would never entice anybody to go up in a draft.
As effectively as this film captures the horror of being in the midst of a war, I didn't always feel like this movie was doing anything that I haven't seen a war film do before. It just does many of the things that war films are good at doing, also very good, and in some ways, especially technically, being pretty top notch. I guess it's not that novel to say that war is awful, and we've had movies that have said this before. The book is, I think, 100 years old practically. So I guess it's not surprising that maybe it doesn't introduce anything new to the genre, story-wise or substance-wise. But I guess I did feel often like I was in familiar territory with this movie. I felt that a lot of the techniques were extremely impressive, and at the same time, it didn't feel like it had a distinct style. It was stylish, and then it felt like a big, technically impressive, immersive war movie. But it felt like it was in the style of a big, technically impressive, immersive war movie. And I would maybe say that it didn't feel so much like, wow, the director is really doing something different here that I haven't seen and is implementing consistent techniques that are kind of challenging me. For example, a movie like Come and See.
I mean, I kind of agree with what you're saying, that the director doesn't have an autorial vision for the story. But I don't think that was the point. I think it was just to do justice to the source material and tell the story in an immersive way. I think one of the problems you can have with a story like this, where you have a character who's sort of anonymous, we don't really know much about him. Part of immersion is putting us into a character's shoes and then being them in that moment. And the more we know about that character, the more deep we can get into their mindset as they approach different obstacles. And so here it's just a survivalist obstacle most of the time. And we're invested to the extent that we want to live ourselves. We might want to make it back somewhere, but that somewhere is not really defined here. It's sort of amorphous. It would be nice to know maybe if this kid was looking forward to a warm soup or maybe the embrace of his mother, but we don't even know a detail like that. And so I think that does leave us a little bit out of the story, but at the same time, there were moments where the story did compensate for that. There was this great moment, I think you agree, this is maybe the best part of the film, where he encounters a soldier from the other side, and there's a sort of moment of recognition and intimacy between them. And that's all I'm gonna say. That made me care a lot about what was going on. His humanity and his dilemma were very transparent, but not every scene was imbued with this sort of moral complexity. A lot of it is just this person needs to survive. So story-wise, I wasn't blown away by it, but at the same time, this is a faithful adaptation and many people won't be looking for anything more. And it's not a problem necessarily that the movie doesn't try to deliver more. It's allowed to be a more contained story and just be about the horrors of war. Have I seen this before and does it feel a little familiar story-wise? Yeah, absolutely. But the filmmaking was so rich that it didn't really matter to me. Though it does make some of the scenes where you're outside of the battle feel a little bit slow. I definitely felt like this film dragged when we weren't in combat, which is kind of sad to say. I don't want to just be watching a movie waiting for the next battle scene. Although there were definitely some valuable moments, especially with Daniel Bruhl's character, who plays a German who is seeking to end the war, that I thought were really important. I actually did like when they got a little bit into the politics of war, where generals and politicians are making decisions on behalf of these massive amounts of boys being sent out to be killed. That's a really important thing to contrast.
I do agree that those scenes were important in like shaping what this story is really like about. But it did feel sometimes when we were cutting back to them that we were kind of learning the same thing we did last time when we cut back to them. And there were moments like the one that you mentioned where I did feel myself like kind of pick up and become more interested, where the movie felt like it was doing something a little different than just the onslaught of combat and hell that we're seeing for most of the film. There are also a couple scenes off on this ranch, like by this chicken coop, and I think that those scenes had a really great payoff. I think that's where a lot of the substance in the movie really comes from, is these smaller moments. And I think that the end is also really good.
I feel very similarly to how I felt about 1917. So if you love that movie, I think you will really like this film. You're really taken through an immersive experience where the camera work is meant to make you feel like you are there. It's quite similar, and I really feel like if this were an English language film, I would have no problem seeing this getting into Best Picture, because this is just the kind of film that it's so technically well done that I think voters will immediately perk up. Like at the first scene, they'll be thinking about the categories in which this film could be nominated and deserves to be nominated.
Yeah, I think the cinematography was pretty spectacular, and the way that many of these scenes were lit or colored was really special about this movie. Some of the nighttime scenes have like this deep blue haze, or some scenes have a grayish fog to them. Really appreciated how the look of the scenes kind of switched up and how everything was painted in this movie. It was pretty beautiful looking, and the camera work is kind of extraordinarily smooth at times. There are some really great immersive long takes here.
The production design is also pretty insane. The camera, kind of like 1917, just travels through great distances sometimes, and it feels like there's just no end in sight. It also feels like the visual effects are blended really nicely with the environments. The trenches feel very real and detailed and grimy. The makeup is also really impressive here, and it's also very character driven, the way that this character's face becomes more and more like encrusted in mud as the film goes along.
And the sound design in this movie is like top fucking tier
insane
war movie.
The surround sound was insane for this movie, and I feel bad for people who can't or won't end up watching this movie in theaters. If you can see this in a theater, I would highly recommend it, especially during the first scene. Just feeling like there were bombs popping off like all around you, and feeling like in the sounds that you could tell where they were and how in the distance they were and when they were encroaching.
Yeah, the sense of distance in the sound work was like phenomenal. There's also this great scene where they're like hiding under the trench, and there's all this like rumbling going on, and like dust is clouding everything, and that scene has totally immersive sound design.
I also want to mention that the lead actor in this film is fantastic. I think a lot of the reason that you feel the terror in this film is because his acting is so real and magnetic. He was perfect in this role, which looked grueling. It looked like a really difficult part to play, because whenever the camera starts rolling, you have to get your adrenaline up to an insane level to make us feel like you are this soldier in this moment. But we really believe that like he's just having this constant like panic attack and just mental breakdown as things are happening around him. And I think this film has some really great examples of show not tell, where like the substance is derived just from like the series of images that were shown.
The score from Volker Brettleman is really great here. The most distinct element is what it might be like some distorted guitar or string instrument that is interestingly like modern, that has this like encroaching sense of dread. Some of the louder snare hits also play into this theme, and there are some like lighter, more floaty string arrangements that I thought were also really beautiful.
Yeah, I was really impressed with the score on this one. It does go big, so it's something that you will notice like very obviously. It calls a lot of attention to itself. But I did like in this instance that the music was attempting to add something to the story by just having these abrasive and jarring sounds. And there's also some theme with an organ in it. That's all I can remember right now, which I thought was really beautiful. And on that note, we should get into Oscar nominations. But before we do, I will rate this movie. I will rate this movie an 8 out of 10.
I'm somewhere between a 7 and an 8 on this movie. Like, I think that it deserves an 8. I guess I just didn't walk away like feeling like this is going to be one that I'm thinking about outside of maybe some of the more impressive technical elements. First of all, this movie is going to get an international feature nomination. Germany did submit it, and it could win that category. If it gets a few tech nominations and Decision to Leave only has international, it's going to look like All Quiet's going to win. The movie has a lot of tech potential. I think at the bare minimum, this movie's getting a sound nomination. If Top Gun wasn't there, this could maybe win sound. I even kind of wonder if maybe Top Gun should be slightly worried. That'd be like if this movie got Best Picture, maybe Top Gun could be worried. I can't tell how many tech elements could become in the cards for this movie. I guess overall, the interesting thing here is that before TIFF, people didn't really expect this to be a player outside of international feature. And this movie also premiered mid to late TIFF, and the buzz started catching on very late. And now Netflix kind of has to decide if they want to put this out in front of people or not based on that. It's kind of weird. Normally, if a movie has buzz before TIFF, or the movie develops so much buzz during TIFF that it's undeniable. But this one still is kind of like this question mark. And part of that's because it's international. I really can't tell what's going to happen with this one, but if you just go up the list of potential techs, cinematography could happen. I was even thinking the cinematography is strong enough to win. It really does feel like some combination of Lubezki and Deakins at times. There are shots of some forests in these beautiful but haunting locations that feel like Emmanuel Lubezki's work. And then I think the battle scenes do feel like Roger Deakins' work in 1917. A little bit, but the camera work is very dynamic and it moves between close-ups and mediums and long shots. The cinematography is that strong, and if this film is beginning to get recognized outside of international, I think that could easily go along with it. I hope I'm not overselling that, because international films do have this uphill battle. And another nomination that seems very, very possible is makeup. I think that actually might be the third most likely nomination behind sound. Also production design. With a war movie on this scale, it falls pretty easily into other war movies on this scale that have been nominated here. It just really depends, again, if the work is pushed out to a wider audience and if people actually see it. They'll probably nominate it.
Yeah, and I think it will help if people do get to see this in a theater as well. And it doesn't just feel like another movie that's on Netflix. That's important.
Yeah, that's going to be a big part of whether or not this movie plays, I think, is if Netflix hypes it up beyond just another Netflix movie, like you said. But this is also the most expensive movie that Germany's ever made, right? So they can't let this fall through the cracks. This actually wasn't the most overly edited war film, but the association of war film and editing could be strong enough that this movie just gets nominated. And finally, score, I think, is not the most necessary thing.
It was good enough to get nominated. It's just it's kind of like everything else at this point. You can throw out a lot of nominations that this could get, and it's maybe just time will tell. But score is kind of a stacked category, and it's one of those where anything can happen.
And so what about picture and director? I'm on the fence with it right now. It's very much a wait and see kind of movie, because we don't know how it's going to play. But from what I've seen on LETTERBOXD mainly with how people are reacting to this, I think it does have the reviews. I think a lot of people feel really strongly about it, very much, again, in the same way of 1917. Maybe some people say this isn't a movie that is so new or that we haven't seen before, but other people just feel like it was so immersive, so impressive, and so well done that maybe it's one of their favorites of the year.
I could see this having a really strong IMDb score. And it's also kind of unlike other international films where this would be one of the more populist movies, in a sense, to be nominated. The target for this audience is in a way, it's an Oscar voter and your dad.
I don't really know if I agree totally, because this movie is very dark and not an ounce of feel good, and it is kind of relentless.
That's true. It's also a little slow. It takes its time. And it's a long movie for kind of the little ground that it covers story-wise.
Most war movies at the Oscars, like a Hacksaw Ridge or a 1917, have some element of heroism in them. This movie doesn't even try to do that. So I think maybe there's a limit to this movie's appeal. However, if you're somebody who appreciates movies on a technical level, you could easily just eat it up. And then you look at director. Some people like to go, look, international filmmaker, the director's branch does that very often. Maybe this is the international pick. Now, I would hesitate to say that the director's branch will nominate somebody because they're international or that gives them a leg up. They're just more likely to pay attention to filmmakers like that.
He's not an established auteur, whereas a lot of these filmmakers who break into this category in an international film are established auteurs, and the director's branch loves that.
I'm not necessarily convinced that this would get director even if it was in picture. I think it would definitely be in the running.
Let's put it this way. The more tech nominations this film can get, and it seems like it can secure, the more likely it is in picture. I mean, if this is featured in like 3, 4, 5 categories, that's pretty solid. I think your chances for a Best Picture nomination are pretty solid, actually. And it's easy to see it getting into like makeup, sound, cinematography. And then if it got production design, if it got like 4, I would be like, wow, that could definitely get into 10.
Yeah, it's hard to say how many this could get without getting in picture. Also, adapted screenplay with the category being empty. However, I don't really think that there's much to the writing or that it's a very righty movie, so I don't really know if that would happen. But, I mean, 1917 got nominated, and this is also based on a very, very famous novel.
On its best day, how many nominations could this thing get? Like,
picture, director, screenplay, cinematography, editing, international sound, production design, makeup.
It's 9. Well, if it got a score, it would be 10.
I don't think it would get 10, but I mean, but let's get 8 or 9.
But just theoretically, it could get 10. I would like to just say, if the lead actor got hype, I would be happy for him to fill in that like kind of barren 5th slot for Best Actor. I don't think this will happen, but I kind of think it's sad that it won't happen. It's a really interesting one. It's actually one that I'm really excited about because it keeps me on my toes to see what's going to happen with it. You can stay tuned to see where this is in our next Oscars video.
Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. Will you stay quiet when you're on the Western Front?